One bridge, a single exchange of gunfire on the night of July 7, 1937, and an already tense region lurched into full-scale war. Surviving the surge, China's grueling quest for dominance, is the story of how a fractured nation, beleaguered by foreign invasion, internal rivalry, and repeated humanitarian catastrophe, was remade by a dozen years of violence. It is not a tidy story of inevitable ascent. It is a chronicle of choices made under duress, of staggering human loss, and of political transformations that set the stage for a new order by 1949. The shot at Marco Polo Bridge was small in the moment, but enormous in consequence. Japanese troops stationed around Beijing and in the puppet state of Manchukuo were already poised to expand their control over northern China. Long-standing grievances, Japanese imperial ambitions, and a military culture that prized aggressive action combined with local incidents to escalate a border clash into a nationwide campaign. For the Nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, the wartime calculus was immediate and wrenching. The priority of national survival collided with a decades-long war against domestic rivals, the Communists, who controlled rural hinterlands and waged a guerrilla struggle of their own. Chiang's initial instinct, in policy and practice through much of the 1930s, had been to suppress internal dissent. The border shooting would force a partial and uneasy truce among Chinese factions, but unity remained fragile. By late summer 1937, modern warfare had come to China's cities. Shanghai, China's largest port, its commercial showcase, its international settlement where Western bankers, missionaries, and journalists lived side by side with Chinese merchants, became the conflict's conspicuous battleground. Japanese commanders expected a quick victory. They encountered instead a determined defense. Artillery thundered over the waterfront. Chinese troops, drawn from both regular units and local volunteers, fought house to house. For weeks, the battle turned neighborhoods into rubble and freight yards into killing grounds. The visible intensity of the fighting and the presence of foreign correspondents and consular observers in Shanghai transmitted images of the war into living rooms around the world. Photographs of burned buildings and civilians fleeing by tram became shorthand for the brutality taking shape in East Asia. Shanghai's fall, when it came in November 1937, was a tactical victory that exacted heavy price. The fighting demonstrated Japanese air power and mechanized advantages, but it also exposed logistical limits. Supplying forces over long stretches of coast and occupied territories strained Japan's supply lines. The Chinese defenders, meanwhile, bought time. That delay mattered. It allowed a fragile, improvisational mobilization of troops and resources across provinces. It multiplied refugee flows away from the front, and it crystallized international sympathy, moral outrage that would, in due course, shape diplomatic stances and material aid in complicated and often halting ways. If Shanghai was the stage, Nanking would be the moral catastrophe. When Japanese forces entered China's then capital in December 1937, what unfolded in the weeks that followed became emblematic of the war's worst crimes. The city had been declared undefended by many of its military leaders, and tens of thousands of civilians, along with foreign missionaries and business people, sought refuge, some within the boundaries of a so-called safety zone established by a handful of Westerners, among them the German businessman John Rabe. Rabe and other expatriates tried to shield civilians using the moral authority of their national status and by coordinating relief within a narrow perimeter. Their diaries and dispatches would later provide crucial testimony to the scope of suffering. Eyewitness accounts from survivors, missionaries, diplomats, and soldiers all describe wide-scale violence, executions, mass shootings, systematic sexual violence, forced labor, and the burning of neighborhoods. Estimates of the death toll are contested and range widely. Different scholars and archival sources have suggested numbers from tens of thousands to more than 200,000, with many contemporary historians citing figures in the low hundreds of thousands. The precise count remains disputed. Historians emphasize ranges and methodological caveats, but the qualitative reality is undisputed. Nanking represented systematic brutality on a massive scale, weaving a moral rupture that reverberated across continents. The international press registered horror. Diplomatic protests followed. Yet outrage did not translate into direct intervention capable of halting Japanese atrocities in the short term. If the fall of Nanking shocked the world, it was soon matched by harder strategic choices made by Chinese authorities, decisions that sacrificed lives in the name of delaying the invader. In the winter of 1938, as Japanese forces advanced into northern China along multiple axes, the Nationalist government ordered the intentional breaching of the Yellow River dikes. The purpose was military. By flooding vast tracts of land, defenders hoped to create an impassable barrier and slow the Japanese advance toward the economic heartland and the wartime capital they were preparing in the interior. The flood achieved some of its tactical aims by diverting or delaying enemy movements, but the human cost was enormous.
Millions were displaced. Estimates of deaths and casualties vary according to source. Some accounts speak of hundreds of thousands killed outright. Others describe far greater numbers when famine, disease, and long-term displacement are included.
Whatever the numerical truth, the flood produced a humanitarian catastrophe. Villages washed away, crops ruined for seasons, and an already fragile society pushed to the brink. The war's center of gravity shifted inland as the Nationalist government moved its administrative core to Wuhan and later to Chongqing, then often transliterated as Chongqing. These cities became hubs of prolonged resistance and strategic relocation. Chongqing, carved into the mountains and reachable through winding roads and limited rail lines, served as a wartime capital under near-constant aerial bombardment. The city's residents and administrators adapted to repeated night raids, constructing air raid shelters and improvising civil defense. Refugee columns, families carrying meager possessions and the dead, moved through cities and along roads, amplifying the sense of national dislocation. The grinding attrition of war produced chronic shortages. Staple foods, medicines, and clothing became scarce. Industries in occupied regions were stripped or destroyed. Transportation networks suffered repeated disruptions. The war was not fought only on battlefields. It was embedded in the struggle to sustain cities, maintain morale, and feed millions. Internationally, China's fate folded into a shifting web of great power interests. For 2 decades, Japanese expansion had been shadowed by complicated foreign policies. In the 1930s, the German Empire had been a military advisor to Chiang's regime, training officers and offering technical support. Soviet aid, meanwhile, became essential when forces and equipment were forwarded to Chinese lines in the late 1930s and early 1940s, though Moscow's engagement was driven by its own strategic calculations. The United States wrung its hands in public over Japanese aggression, but official intervention was limited until the Pacific War widened. American volunteer aviators, organized informally under Claire Chennault as the Tigers, provided crucial early air support and a propaganda boost for Chinese resistance from 1937 into 1941. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Western material assistance increased under programs such as Lend-Lease, but logistical realities in competing theaters meant resources were often insufficient and unevenly allocated. Amid external aid and constant domestic upheaval, the Japanese military continued to press offensives. Their tactics evolved from rapid advances to sustained operations intended to break China's remaining capacity to resist. One of the largest of these efforts was Operation Ichigo in 1944, a sweeping offensive designed to secure a continuous rail link from north to south, to seize American air bases used for bombing the Japanese homeland, and to suffocate Chinese resistance. Initially, Ichigo yielded tactical successes. Japanese columns captured airfields and railways in Henan, Hunan, and Guangxi. They forced American and Chinese units to withdraw from vulnerable positions.
Yet the operation also exposed limits. By then, Japan faced severe shortages of manpower and materiel, and occupying vast swaths of hostile territory only intensified logistical strain. Ichigo's territorial gains could not produce decisive strategic advantage. Instead, they deepened exhaustion on both sides and accelerated the collapse of Japanese strategic coherence. Throughout these campaigns, accusations of chemical and biological warfare, forced labor, and medical experimentation circulated among diplomats, military intelligence, and survivors. Some contemporaneous reports, along with Japanese military documents and later scholarly investigations, support allegations of deliberate biological attacks and a program of systematic wartime abuses conducted by particular Japanese units. Where claims are contested, historians rely on archives, survivor testimony, and cross-referenced evidence to assemble the picture. Where documentation is incomplete, scholars flag uncertainty. The ethical contours of the conflict emerge in these contested spaces. Responsibility, command culpability, and the mechanisms by which atrocity becomes policy are debated in archives and courtrooms alike. By 1945, the broader contours of global war had turned decisively against Japan. Sustained Allied bombing, the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan in August 1945, and rapid offensive in Manchuria, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki all combined to force Japanese surrender. But surrender did not settle China's political future. The capitulation of Japanese forces left millions of weapons, bases, and administrative vacuums scattered across the country. Which Chinese authority would assume control of these assets, the internationally recognized nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, or the communist forces under Mao Zedong, who had expanded influence and control in rural areas during the war, was a question of logistics, politics, and the rapid deployment of forces. The immediate post-war period was chaotic. The Soviet occupation of Manchuria after August 1945 is crucial to understanding what followed. Soviet forces accepted the surrender of Japanese units in the northeast and, in many locales, handed over captured Japanese arms to Chinese communist units, whether intentionally or through local decisions. The transfer of equipment and the availability of Soviet-controlled railways gave communist armies a material advantage as civil war resumed. The United States, exhausted from years of global war and wary of deep intervention, provided significant diplomatic and material support to the Nationalists, but was unwilling to commit the level of ground forces or political reconstruction that might have stabilized the KMT's position.
American generals such as Joseph Stilwell, who had complex, fraught relationships with Chiang and played a tangled role in training and advising, argued for different strategies and frequently found themselves at odds with political leaders in both capitals. Civil war resumed in earnest by 1946. It was not a simple replay of pre-war antagonisms. The preceding years of occupation and resistance had reshaped communities, modes of political mobilization, and military organization. Communist forces reorganized into a more conventional army, the People's Liberation Army, consolidating guerrilla gains into fielded units capable of sustained campaigns. Land reform and the Communists' promises of change won significant rural support, feeding recruitment and eroding the Nationalists' social base in many regions. The Nationalist forces, burdened by corrupt supply chains, inflation, and waning popular support in some quarters, found themselves fighting an enemy bolstered by momentum and increasingly sophisticated operations. The decisive sequences of 1948-1949 unfolded rapidly. Campaigns in Manchuria, the Liaoshen campaign, cut off nationalist forces and transferred control of the northeast to communist hands. The Huaihai campaign in central China and the Pinjin campaign in the north further broke nationalist field armies and resulted in the capture of major cities. These victories were not simply the product of military prowess. They reflected political consolidation, effective logistics, and the exploitation of nationalist weaknesses, ranging from inflated currency to fractured command structures. Refugee flows swelled anew as entire municipalities changed hands. Millions of civilians found themselves under new authorities or in flight once more. By the summer of 1949, the outcome had become clear. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in Beijing. Chiang and remnants of the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. The proclamation marked the effective end of the Civil War, though occasional fighting continued, and the diplomatic recognition of China would remain contested in world politics for decades. To say the PRC's founding was merely the product of wartime struggle would be an oversimplification. It was the culmination of political choices, social transformations, foreign interventions, and the management of exhaustion and opportunity. The crucible of 1937-1949 had exhausted some actors and empowered others. It had redistributed arms and legitimacy in ways that mattered decisively. What then did this grueling quest for survival leave behind? The human toll is large and complex. Military casualties on all sides numbered in the millions over the decade, and civilian deaths from combat, forced migrations, famine, and disease add to figures that historians still refine and dispute. Families were uprooted, entire local economies collapsed, and cities, some of them ancient seats of commerce and culture, were left in ruins.
The refugee flows and collapse of local administrations produced social dislocation that lasted for years, shaping demographic patterns and memories across generations. Institutionally, the war shaped state capacity in significant ways. Wartime mobilization pushed political actors to consolidate authority, streamline logistics, and adopt new forms of governance. In territories under communist control, land reform campaigns and populist mobilization created local administrative networks that would later dovetail with centralized state structures. For the Nationalists, wartime demands exposed weaknesses: rampant inflation in the post-war years, corruption within supply systems, and the inability to secure economic stability under hemorrhaging military expenditures. Foreign aid, Soviet, German, and American at various times, provided lifelines, but also created dependencies and political complications. These international connections mattered. Captured Japanese arms in Manchuria, Soviet transferred equipment, and American Lend-Lease supplies at different moments altered local balances of force. The moral legacy of the years 1937-1949 remains fraught. Atrocity, whether in the form of the Nanking Massacre or other documented episodes of systematic violence, left an undying scar. The ethical questions about command responsibility, about how civilians are protected or abandoned in war, and about the lines between military necessity and crime would fuel post-war tribunals, diplomatic tensions, and decades of contested memory.
For survivors and their descendants, the period is not an abstract phase of history, but a repository of personal loss and communal trauma. Yet it is important to resist easy teleologies. The dramatic expansion of China's centralized power after 1949 was not a simple or inevitable reward for wartime suffering. It was one possible trajectory among many, shaped by the interplay of domestic political strategies, foreign interventions, resource distribution, and sheer contingency. The war's crucible created structural conditions, population movements, concentration of political authority, militarized cadres that could be leveraged in various ways. Which path the nation would take depended as much on choices in the immediate post-war years as on the scars carried forward. Throughout this story, ordinary people tried to survive. Consider the merchant in Shanghai whose warehouse burned in an artillery strike, who then joined relief efforts in a makeshift camp, helping to distribute rice while burying a neighbor. Or the woman in Nanking who recorded in a cramped notebook the names of those she had hidden in the safety zone. Her entries would later be cross-referenced with foreign diaries by researchers seeking to reconstruct events. Think of the family that fled toward Chongqing in the procession of carts and bicycles, children wrapped in blankets as rain turned the roads to mud, only to arrive malnourished and without shelter.
These human vignettes, small, concrete, and difficult, are the textures that give moral weight to dates and campaigns. If there is a strategic lesson in this era, it is one of complexity. Military superiority in one domain, air power or fast-moving columns, does not guarantee sustainable control if politics, logistics, and moral legitimacy are lacking. External aid can be decisive at particular moments, but seldom substitutes for domestic cohesion. And wartime decisions made under the pressure of imminent defeat, such as breaching dikes or scorched earth policies, produce outcomes whose moral and material consequences often outlast their tactical utility. For students of military history and international relations, these years also illustrate how regional conflicts can be shaped and reshaped by global currents. The Second World War's broader dynamics, Soviet strategy, American priorities, the shifting balance of naval and air power, all fed into local outcomes in China. Likewise, the post-war settlement in Asia was not simply the product of battlefield outcomes, but of diplomatic bargains, of which cities and weapons ended up in whose control, and of the willingness of great powers to commit resources. Surviving the surge, then, is not only the story of how China endured invasion and internal war. It is the story of how survival itself became a strategy for political transformation. The desperate measures of the late 1930s and 40s, military reunifications, agrarian mobilizations, wartime administrations, laid institutional foundations that different actors could exploit in the years to come. They also produced a memoryscape filled with loss and accusation, which would shape domestic politics and foreign relations for decades. If this account has raised questions you want answered in more depth about specific battles, contested casualty figures, or the archive evidence on biological warfare and civilian testimony, subscribe and check the description for a reading list with primary sources and major scholarly works. In that list, you will find citations that reflect the range of estimates and the debates scholars continue to have about contested episodes. As the century turned, the consequences of the struggle for survival continued to be debated. The People's Republic of China emerged from a century of humiliation and war with centralized authority and a capacity to mobilize resources that its earlier fragmented rulers had lacked. But that emergence cannot be read as a straightforward payoff for suffering. It was the contingent result of wartime logistics, foreign aid, internal politics, and the messy aftermath of imperial collapse. The human cost, the lives lost, the cities razed, the communities uprooted, remains central to any honest assessment. Survivors recounted their lives not as a march to destiny, but as a sequence of choices, escapes, and losses.
Veterans and civilians alike rebuilt societies out of rubble, negotiated new loyalties, and bore the burden of memory. The international community watched, sometimes with outrage, sometimes with calculation, and in many cases with limited capacity to alter events on the ground. In the end, the decade between Marco Polo Bridge and the proclamation in Beijing was a crucible that remade China. It was a grueling quest for dominance, only insofar as the war and its aftermath forged a political and administrative order capable of centralized control. That order and the memories that accompanied its birth would in turn shape the nation's subsequent path on the world stage. But those outcomes were not inevitable. They were the product of struggle, contingency, and the tragic arithmetic of survival during a time of almost unimaginable pressure. For further study and to explore the primary sources behind the contested figures and testimonies mentioned here, consult the description below for a curated reading list of archives, survivor memoirs, and recent scholarship. Historians continue to refine estimates and interpretations. When figures are contested, the best practice is to regard them as ranges and to consult sources directly. If you found this account valuable and want to follow more deep dives in Asia's 20th century transformations, subscribe and explore the rest of the series. This history is difficult, and remembering it honestly requires careful attention to evidence, nuance, and the voices of those who lived through it.